So, center damper, pitch damper, this guy. There's a lot of things to go through, so it's going to be a little more of a bulletin form, but I'm still going to explain some things. But first off, it's oil, and oil comes in weights, either W, WT, or as in this, CST. This is 100. It's very much a thin liquid. This is a 200, and it's a lot thicker. They go up to like 1,000,000, but that's gear diff oil. Let's not go through that. So with the thinner oil, the action of the shock is going to be faster, because moving the piston up and down in a thin liquid is going to be faster. So therefore your weight transfer is also going to be faster. So it's going to be a faster reacting car, because the suspension works faster, and it also have a tendency to be a more smoothly way of keeping your car's tires in contact with the track. It absorbs bumps better and is better for a bumpy track. It does have the tendency to make the car a little bit more unsettled when you change directions fast, like in a fast chicane. It has a very good shift balance, or weight transfer balance to the rear, so the rear traction is going to be higher. It does take a longer to accelerate out the corner, because it keeps on compressing, because the oil is thinner. The thicker oil provides a little bit more resistance. If that's a little bit hard to understand, when a car accelerates, it compresses the spring. As long as it's compressing the spring, the tires are moving energy into the damper and not providing forward traction. That's how simple I can explain it. Also, the thinner oil may cause the car to wander a little bit, but that's for the thin oil. For the thicker viscosity oils, there of course is going to be a slower reaction time, a slower weight transfer, but that will result in a more stable car at high speeds, but also a more twitchy car at low speeds. It's not so great with bumps, so it's better for a very smooth track. RCP is relatively smooth, but if the joints are not completely locked together in some certain areas, it will be not ideal. The car is also less likely to become unsettled when changing directions, like in the chicane, where the thin oil is going to be a little bit unsettled. It shifts the balance to the front. It provides more front traction and more steering, where the thin oil provides more rear traction. And it also takes less time to accelerate out of corners, because of course it has more resistance. So the energy that the tires produce isn't going up into the damper, it's going straight down to the racetrack and makes your car go fast forward. So that was oil. Next thing. So rebound. Rebound is when the piston extends from the body due to there being a excessive amount of oil inside the damper. Hard to understand. So this is at 1/10 scale damper, and its rebound is set to about 50%. So the rebound, the oil inside the damper here will push this piston out about halfway. There you go. So you do that in the Mini-Z with adding more oil. So having more rebound, having more of the piston go out, will make the car more responsive. Like it's more responsive in the steering. But it has a tendency to be bouncier over uneven parts, like the locking joints on the RCP plates. Having less rebound, like the damper isn't coming out that much, it's gonna make the car feel less responsive, but it's also gonna be less bouncy over bumps, and therefore easier to drive on RCP tracks if there's not properly assembled joints. So that was the Rebound, and again, the how to do it is to open the cap here, fill more oil in, compress it, and see if it goes out further, and go from there. It's a feeling thing. You can measure it out. Like, you can measure out from the bottom here to the top here how much it goes, and that's your setup. Next thing. So, the spring, the thing that all people change. What does it do? Well, a softer spring up here will result in more weight to be transferred to the rear. It generates more rear traction. It's better to handle bumps. It does reduce acceleration out of the corner, as we talked about before, when this can just compress. The energy from the tire is not going to the track, it's going to the damper. It has greater off-power steering, meaning that when you go off the power, it will have greater steering, but it will have less on-power steering, because as this compresses, as we talked about in the first video, the front lifts as long as this compresses. And if this lifts, you will have less steering. So this is on-power steering. You will have less of that with a softer spring. So a stiffer spring. Well, less weight can be transferred to the rear of the car, resulting in less rear traction. It handles worse over bumps. It has better acceleration. It has less off-power steering, but greater on-power steering. And remember, the spring and the oil inside must follow each other. So when you use a lighter oil, you might want to consider a lighter spring. If you use a heavier oil, maybe you want to also jump up and use a heavier spring or stiffer spring. Yep, next one. So the last thing, well, at least the last thing around the damper is the angle of the damper. And you might be sitting there, what? So, the damper in Kyosho cars are normally flat, but you can angle them upward, not like this. But you can angle them so the rear part is higher than the front part here. So like this, very exaggerated. Huh? What that does is, the more angle, like the greater the shock angle, the shock does less work and has a reduced impact as the angle increases. What does that mean? It means that the car will be duller, but the more weight is transferred to the rear, it will gain more rear power. It will have, it will have less on-power steering, but greater rear traction. The flatter the damper is, the shock does more work, and it means the car is more reactive to your inputs. It's a little bit more touchy-feely. It's not as dull as when you angle the damper up. The less weight is, of course, then transferred to the rear. You also have less rear power, but you have greater on-power steering. So when you're on power, it will be greater. With all this information, as I said in one of the other videos, setting up a car is just compromises. So don't go out there and just crank that angle up to get greater rear, greater rear traction, and a stiffer spring for better acceleration and all that, because you're gonna have a negative effect of that, and that is less steering. So everything you see here, do one thing, apply one thing, test it out, and then apply other things with what you see the car is doing on the track after you made the initial setup change. one step at a time. With that said, next video.